Well, you know I stayed
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
stayed
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness, stayed
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness till I died.
In the wilderness.
Oh Lord,
In the wilderness.
stayed
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
stayed
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness till I died.
Till I
Lord, you know I'm on
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
on
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
on
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness till I died.
In the wilderness.
Oh yes,
In the wilderness.
oh
In the
Lord,
wilderness.
wilderness.
In the
Oh
wilderness.
yes,
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness. Oh,
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness till I died.
Well, then I stayed
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
stayed
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
stayed
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness
In the
till I died.
In the wilderness.
Oh Lord,
In the wilderness.
stayed
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
stayed
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness, stayed
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness
In the
till I
wilderness.
died.
Till I
Well, then I'm born
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
born
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
born
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness
In the
till I died.
In the wilderness.
Oh Lord,
In the wilderness.
born
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
born
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
born
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness
In the
till I
wilderness.
died.
Till I
Well,
died.
yes, I preached
In the wilderness.
in the
In
wilderness,
the wilderness.
preached
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
preached
In the wilderness.
in the
In
wilderness
the wilderness.
till I died.
In the
Oh
wilderness.
yeah,
In the
then I
wilderness.
preached
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
preached
In the wilderness.
in the
In the
wilderness,
wilderness.
preached
In the wilderness.
in the
In the
wilderness till I
wilderness.
died.
Till I
Well,
died.
then I sing
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
sing
Lord, in the wilderness.
in the
In
wilderness,
the wilderness.
sing
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness
In the
till I
wilderness.
died.
In the wilderness.
Oh Lord,
Lord,
then I sing
in the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
sing
In the wilderness.
in the
In the
wilderness,
wilderness.
sing
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness
In the
till I
wilderness.
died.
Till I
Yeah,
died.
I'm gonna stay
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
stay
Lord, in the wilderness.
in the
In
wilderness,
the wilderness.
stay
In the wilderness.
in the
In the
wilderness till I
wilderness.
died.
In the wilderness.
Oh Lord,
In the wilderness.
then I stay
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
stay
In the wilderness.
in the
In the
wilderness,
wilderness.
stay
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness till I died.
Till I
Well,
died.
I'm gonna pray
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
pray
In the wilderness.
in the
In the
wilderness,
wilderness.
pray
In the wilderness.
in the
In the
wilderness till I
wilderness.
died.
In the wilderness.
Oh Lord,
In the
then I
wilderness.
pray
In the wilderness.
in the wilderness,
In the wilderness.
pray